He was glad to see his venerable friend and one-time rescuer at the head of Arthur's detachment, a collar of rank around his sleek neck, and whiskers bristling at his martial angle. Better still, as a sub-lieutenant in that army was a brisk young fellow who proved to be none other than the very little kitten at the inn to whom Carter had given a saucer of rich cream on that long-vanished morning in Arthur. He was a strapping and promising cat now, and purred as he shook hands with his friend. His grandfather said he was doing very well in the army, and that he might well expect a captaincy after one more campaign. Carter now outlined the peril of the cat tribe and was rewarded by deep-throated purrs of gratitude from all sides. Consulting with the generals, he prepared a plan of instant action which involved marching at once upon the Zoog Council and other known strongholds of Zoogs, forestalling their surprise attacks and forcing them to terms before their mobilization of their army of invasion. Thereupon, without a moment's loss, that great ocean of cats flooded the enchanted wood and surged around the council tree and the great stone circle. Flutterings rose to panic pitch as the enemy saw the newcomers, and there was very little resistance among the furtive and curious brown Zoogs. They saw that they were beaten in advance and turned from thoughts of vengeance to thoughts of present self-preservation. Half the cats now seated themselves in a circular formation with the captured Zoogs in the centre, leaving open a lane down which were marched the additional captives, rounded up by the other cats in other parts of the wood. Terms were discussed at length, Carter acting as interpreter, and it was decided that the Zoogs might remain a free tribe on condition of rendering to the cats a large annual tribute of grouse, quail, and pheasants from the less fabulous parts of their forest. 12 young Zoogs of noble families were taken as hostages to be kept in the temple of the cats of Arthur, and the victors made it plain that any disappearance of cats on the borders of the Zoog domain would be followed by consequences highly disastrous to Zoogs. These matters disposed of, the assembled cats broke ranks and permitted the Zoogs to slink off one by one to their respective homes, which they hastened to do with many a sullen backward glance. The old cat general now offered Carter an escort through the forest to whatever border he wished to reach, deeming it likely that the Zoogs would harbour dire resentment against him for the frustration of their warlike enterprise. This offer he welcomed with gratitude, not only for the safety it afforded, but because he liked the graceful companionship of cats. So, in the midst of a pleasant and playful regiment, relaxed after the successful performance of its duty, Randolph Carter walked with dignity through that enchanted and phosphorescent wood of Titan trees, talking of his quest with the old general and his grandson, whilst others of the band indulged in fantastic gambols or chased fallen leaves that the wind drove among the fungi of the primeval floor. And the old cat said that he had heard much of unknown Kadath in the cold waste, but did not know where it was. As for the marvellous Sunset City, he had not even heard of that, but would gladly relay to Carter anything he might later learn. He gave the seeker some passwords of great value among the cats of Dreamland, and commended him especially to the old chief of the cats in Celifay, whither he was bound. That old cat, already slightly known to Carter, was a dignified Maltese, and would prove highly influential in any transaction. It was dawn when they came to the proper edge of the wood, and Carter bade his friends a reluctant farewell. The young sub-lieutenant he had met as a small kitten would have followed him had not the old general forbidden it, but that austere patriarch insisted that the path of duty lay with the tribe of the army. So Carter set out alone over the golden fields that stretched mysterious beside a willow-fringed river, and the cats went back into the wood. Well did the traveller know those garden lands that lie betwixt the wood and the Serenarian sea, and blithely did he follow the singing river, Ukranos that marked his course. The sun rose higher over gentle slopes of grove and lawn, and heightened the colours of the 1,000 flowers that stared each knoll and dingle. A blessed haze lies upon all this region, wherein is held a little more of the sunlight than other places hold, and a little more of the summer's humming music of birds and bees, so that men walked through it as through a fairy place, and feel greater joy and wonder than they ever afterward remember. By noon, Carter reached the jasper terraces of Kieran, which slope down to the river's edge and bear that temple of loveliness wherein the king of Ulekvad comes from his far realm on the twilight sea once a year in a golden palanquin to pray to the god of Ukranos, who sang to him in youth when he dwelt in a cottage by its banks. All of Jasper is that temple, and covering an acre of ground with its wall and courts, its 7 pinnacled towers, and its inner shrine where the river enters through hidden channels and the god sings softly in the night. Many times the moon hears strange music as it shines on those courts and terraces and pinnacles, but whether that music be the song of the god or the chant of the cryptical priests, none but the king of Ulekvad may say, for only he has entered the temple or sees the priests. Now, in the drowsiness of day, that carven and delicate fane was silent, and Carter heard only the murmur of the great stream and the hum of the birds and bees as he walked onward under an enchanted sun. All that afternoon the pilgrim wandered on through perfumed meadows and in the lee of gentle riverwood hills, bearing peaceful thatched cottages and the shrines of amiable gods carven from jasper or chrysoberyl. Sometimes he walked close to the bank of Ukranos and whistled to the sprightly and iridescent fish that crystal stream possessed, and at other times he paused amidst the whispering rushes and gazed at the great dark wood on the farther side, whose trees came down clear to the water's edge. In former dreams he had seen quaint lumbering buopoffs come shyly out of that wood to drink, but now he could not glimpse any. Once in a while he paused to watch a carnivorous fish catch a fishing bird, which it lured to the water by showing its tempting scales to the sun, and grasped by the beak with its enormous mouth as the winged hunter sought to dart down upon it. Toward evening he mounted a low, grassy rise and saw before him, flaming in the sunset, the 1,000 gilded spires of Thran. Lofty beyond belief are the alabaster walls of that incredible city, sloping inward toward the top and wrought in one solid piece by what means no man knows, for they are more ancient than memory. Yet lofty as they are, with their 100 gates and 200 turrets, the clustered towers within, all white beneath their golden spires, are loftier still, so that men on the plain around see them soaring into the sky, sometimes shining clear, sometimes caught at the top in tangles of cloud and mist, and sometimes clouded lower down with their utmost pinnacles blazing free above the vapours. And where Thran's gates open on the river are great wharfs of marble, with ornate galleons, or fragrant cedar and calamander riding gently at anchor, and strange bearded sailors sitting on casks and bales with the hieroglyphs of far places. Landward beyond the walls lies the farm country, where small white cottages dream between little hills, and narrow roads with many stone bridges wind gracefully among streams and gardens. Down through this verdant land Carter walked at evening and saw twilight float up from the river to the marvellous golden spires of Thran. And just at the hour of dusk he came to the southern gate and was stopped by a red-robed sentry till he had told 3 dreams beyond belief, and proved himself a dreamer worthy to walk up Thran's steep mysterious streets and linger in bazaars where the wares of the ornate galleons were sold. Then into that incredible city he walked, through a wall so thick that the gate was a tunnel, and thereafter mist curved and undulant ways winding deep and narrow between the heavenward towers. Light shone through grated and balconied windows, and the sound of lutes and pipes stole timid from inner courts where marble fountains bubbled. Carter knew his way and edged down through darker streets to the river, where at an old sea tavern he found the captains and seamen he had known in myriad other dreams. There he bought his passage to Celifay on a great green galleon, and there he stopped for the night after speaking gravely to the venerable cat of that inn, who blinked dozing before an enormous hearth and dreamed of old wars and forgotten gods. In the morning, Carter boarded the galleon bound for Celifay and sat in the prow as the ropes were cast off and the long sail down to the Serenarian Sea began. For many leagues the banks were much as they were above Thran, and now and then a curious temple rising on the farther hills toward the right, and the drowsy village on the shore with steep red roofs and nets spread in the sun. Mindful of his search, Carter questioned all the mariners closely about those whom they had met in the taverns of Celifay, asking the names and ways of the strange men with long, narrow eyes, long, lobed ears, thin noses, and pointed chins who came in dark ships from the north and traded onyx for the carved jade and spun gold and little red singing birds of Celifay. Of these men the sailors knew not much, save that they talked but seldom and spread a kind of awe about them. Their land, very far away, was called Inganok, and not many people cared to go thither because it was a cold, twilight land, and said to be close to unpleasant Leng. Although high, impassable mountains towered on the side where Leng was thought to lie, so that none might say whether this evil plateau with its horrible stone villages and unmentionable monastery were really there, or whether the rumour were only a fear that timid people felt in the night when those formidable barrier peaks loomed black against the rising moon. Certainly men reached Leng from very different oceans. Of other boundaries of Inganok those sailors had no notion, nor had they heard of the cold waste and unknown Kadath save from vague, unplaced report, and of the marvellous sunset city which Carter sought they knew nothing at all. So the traveller asked no more of far things, but bided his time till he might talk with those strange men from cold and twilight Inganok, who are the seed of such gods as carved their features in granite. Late in the day the galleon reached those bends of the river which traverse the perfumed jungles of Kled. Here Carter wished he might disembark, for in those tropic tangles sleep wondrous palaces of ivory, lone and unbroken, where once dwelt fabulous monarchs of a land whose name is forgotten. Spells of the Elder Ones keep those places unharmed and undecayed, for it is written that there may be one day need of them again, and elephant caravans have glimpsed them from afar by moonlight, though none dares approach them closely because of the guardians to which their wholeness is due. But the ship swept on, and dusk hushed the hum of the day, and the first stars above blinked answers to the early fireflies on the banks, as that jungle fell far behind, leaving only its fragrance as a memory that it had been. And all through the night that galleon floated on past mysteries unseen and unsuspected. Once a lookout reported fires on the hills to the east, but the sleepy captain said they had better not be looked at too much, since it was highly uncertain just who or what had lit them. In the morning the river had broadened out greatly, and Carter saw by the houses along the banks that they were close to the vast trading city of Llanith on the Serenarian Sea. Here the walls are of rugged granite, and the houses peakedly fantastic and beamed with plastered gables. The men of Llanith are more like those of the waking world than any others in Dreamland, so that the city is not sought except for barter, but is prized for the solid work of its artisans. The wharves of Lanith are of oak, and there the galleon made fast while the captain traded in taverns. Carter also went ashore and looked curiously upon the rutted streets where wooden ox carts lumbered and feverish merchants cried their wares vacuously in the bazaars. The sea taverns were all close to the wharfs on cobbled lane salts with the spray of high tides, and seemed exceedingly ancient with their low black-beamed ceilings and casements of greenish bullseye panes. Ancient sailors in those taverns talked much of distant ports and told many stories of the curious men from Twilight Inganok, but had little to add to what the seamen of the galleon had told. Then at last, after much unloading and loading, the ship set sail once more over the sunset sea, and the high walls and gables of Lanith grew less as the last golden light of day lent them a wonder and beauty beyond any that men had given them. 2 nights and 2 days the galleon sailed over the Cenarian Sea, sighting no land and speaking but one other vessel. Then near sunset on the 2nd day there loomed up ahead the snowy peak of Aran with its ginkgo trees swaying on the lower slopes, and Carter knew that they were come to the land of Uth-Nargai and the marvellous city of Selefei. Swiftly there came into sight the glittering minarets of that fabulous town, and the untarnished marble walls of their bronze statues, and the great stone bridge where Naraxa joins the sea. Then rose the green gentle hills behind the town, with their groves and gardens and asphodels and the small shrines and cottages upon them, and far in the background the purple ridge of the Tenarians, potent and mystical, behind which lay forbidden ways into the waking world and toward other regions of dream. The harbour was full of painted galleys, some of which were from the marble cloud city of Seranion, that lies in ethereal space beyond where the sea meets the sky, and some of which were from the substantial ports of the oceans of Dreamland. Among these the steersman threaded his way up to the spice-fragrant wharfs, where the galleon made fast in the dusk as the city's million lights began to twinkle out over the water. Ever new seemed this deathless city of vision, for here time has no power to tarnish or destroy. As it has always been is still the turquoise of Nath Horthath, and the 80 orchid-wreathed priests are the same who builded it 10,000 years ago. Shining still is the bronze of the great gates, nor are the onyx pavements ever worn or broken, and the great bronze statues on the walls look down on merchants and camel drivers older than fable, yet without one grey hair in their forked beards. Carter did not at once seek out the temple or the palace or the citadel, but stayed by the seaward wall among traders and sailors. And when it was too late for rumours and legends, he sought out an ancient tavern he knew well, and rested with dreams of the sun gods on unknown Kadath, whom he sought. The next day he searched all along the quays for some of the strange mariners of Inganok, but was told that none were now in port, their galleys not being due from the north for 2 weeks. He found, however, one Thorabonian sailor who had been to Inganok and had worked in the onyx quarries of that twilight place, and this sailor said there was certainly a desert to the north of the peopled region, which everybody seemed to fear and shun. The Thorabonian opined that this desert led around the utmost rim of impassable peaks into Leng's horrible plateau, and that this was why men feared it, though he admitted there were other vague tales of evil presences and nameless sentinels. Whether or not this could be the fabled waste wherein unknown Kadath stands, he did not know, but it seemed unlikely that those presences and sentinels, if indeed they truly existed, were stationed for naught. On the following day Carter walked up the street of the pillars to the turquoise temple and talked with the high priest. Though Nath Horthath is chiefly worshipped in Selefei, all the great ones are mentioned in diurnal prayers, and the priest was reasonably versed in their moods. Like a towel in distant author, he strongly advised against any attempt to see them, declaring that they are testy and capricious, and subject to strange protection from the mindless other gods from outside, whose soul and messenger is the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep. Their jealous hiding of the marvelous Sunset City showed clearly that they did not wish Carter to reach it, and it was doubtful how they would regard a guest whose object was to see them and plead before them. No man had ever found Kadath in the past, and it might be just as well if none ever found it in the future. Such rumours as were told about that onyx castle of the Great Ones were not by any means reassuring. Having thanked the orchid-crowned high priest, Carter left the temple and sought the bazaar of the sheep butchers, where the old chief of Seliphae cats dwelt sleek and contented. That grey and dignified being was sunning himself on the onyx pavement and extended a languid paw as his caller approached. But when Carter repeated the passwords and introductions furnished him by the old cat general of Ulthar, the furry patriarch became very cordial and communicative, and told much of the secret lore known to cats on the seaward slopes of Uthnagai. Best of all, he repeated several things told him furtively by the timid waterfront cats of Seliphae about the men of Inganuk, on whose dark ships no cat will go. It seems that these men have an aura not of earth about them, though that is not the reason why no cat will sail on their ships. The reason for this is that Inganuk holds shadows which no cat can endure, so that in all that cold twilight realm there is never a cheering purr or a homely mew. Whether it be because of things wafted over the impassable peaks from hypothetical Leng, or because of things filtering down from the chilly desert to the north, none may say, but it remains a fact that in that far land there broods a hint of outer space which cats do not like, and to which they are more sensitive than men. Therefore they will not go on the dark ships that seek the basalt keys of Inganuk. The old chief of the cats also told him where to find his friend King Kurenes, who in Carter's latter dreams had reigned alternately in the rose-crystal palace of the 70 Delights at Seliphae and in the turreted cloud castle of sky-floating Serenian. It seems that he could no more find content in those places, but had formed a mighty longing for the English cliffs and downlands of his boyhood, where, in little dreaming villages, England's old songs hover at evening behind lattice windows, and where grey church towers peep lovely through the verdure of distant valleys. He could not go back to these things in the waking world because his body was dead, but he had done the next best thing and dreamed a small tract of such countryside in the region east of the city, where meadows roll gracefully up from the sea cliffs to the foot of the Tenarian hills. There he dwelt in a grey Gothic manor house of stone looking on the sea, and tried to think it was ancient Trevor Towers, where he was born and where 13 generations of his forefathers had first seen the light. And on the coast nearby he had built a little Cornish fishing village with steep cobbled ways, settling therein such people as had the most English faces, and seeking ever to teach them the dear remembered accents of old Cornwall fishers. And in a valley not far off he had reared a great Norman abbey, whose tower he could see from his window, placing it in the churchyard grey stones with the names of his ancestors carved thereon, and with a moss somewhat like old England's moss. For though Kurenes was a monarch in the land of dream, with all imagined pomps and marvels, splendours and beauties, ecstasies and delights, novelties and excitements at his command, he would gladly have resigned forever the whole of his power and luxury and freedom for one blessed day as a simple boy in that pure and quiet England, that ancient beloved England, which had moulded his being, and of which he must always be immutably a part. So when Carter bade that old grey chief of the cats adieu, he did not seek the terraced palace of rose crystal, but walked out the eastern gate and across the daisied fields toward a peaked gable, which he glimpsed through the oaks of a park sloping up to the sea cliffs. And in time he came to a great hedge and a gate with a little brick lodge, and when he rang the bell there hobbled to admit him no robed and anointed lackey of the palace, but a small stubbly old man in a smock, who spoke as best he could in the quaint tones of far Cornwall. And Carter walked up the shady path between trees as near as possible to England's trees, and climbed the terraces among gardens set out as in Queen Anne's time. At the door, flanked by stone cats in the old way, he was met by a whiskered butler in suitable livery, and was presently taken to the library where Kurenis, Lord of Uthnagai, and the sky around Seranion, sat pensive in a chair by the window looking on his little sea-coast village and wishing that his old nurse would come in and scold him because he was not ready for that hateful lawn party at the vicar's, with the carriage waiting and his mother nearly out of patience. Kurenis, clad in a dressing gown of the sort favoured by London tailors in his youth, rose eagerly to meet his guest, for the sight of an Anglo-Saxon from the waking world was very dear to him, even if it was a Saxon from Boston, Massachusetts, instead of from Cornwall. And for long they talked of old times, having much to say because both were old dreamers and well versed in the wonders of incredible places. Kurenis indeed had been out beyond the stars in the ultimate void, and was said to be the only one who had ever returned sane from such a voyage. At length Carter brought up the subject of his quest, and asked of his host those questions he had asked of so many others. Kurenis did not know where Kadath was, or the marvellous Sunset City, but he did know that the Great Ones were very dangerous creatures to seek out, and that the other gods had strange ways of protecting them from impertinent curiosity. He had learned much of the other gods in distant parts of space, especially in that region where form does not exist, and coloured gases study the innermost secrets. The violet gas Singak had told him terrible things of the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep, and had warned him never to approach the central void where the daemon Sultan Azathoth gnaws hungrily in the dark. Altogether it was not well to meddle with the Elder Ones, and if they persistently denied all access to the marvellous Sunset City, it were better not to seek that city. Kurenis furthermore doubted whether his guest would profit aught by coming to the city, even were he to gain it. He himself had dreamed and yearned long years for lovely Seliphaes and the land of Uthnagai, and for freedom and colour and high experience of life devoid of its chains, conventions and stupidities. But now that he was come into that city and that land, and was the king thereof, he found the freedom and the vividness all too soon wore out, and monotonous for want of linkage with anything firm in his feelings and memories. He was a king in Uthnagai, but found no meaning therein, and drooped always to the old familiar things of England that had shaped his youth. All his kingdom would he give for the sound of Cornish church bells over the downs, and all the 1,000 minarets of Seliphae for the steep, homely roofs of the village near his home. So he told his guest that the unknown Sunset City might not hold quite the content he sought, and that perhaps it had better remain a glorious and half-remembered dream. For he had visited Carter often in the old waking days, and knew well the lovely New England slopes that had given him birth. At the last he was very certain the seeker would long only for the early remembered scenes, the glow of Beacon Hill at evening, the tall steeples and winding hill streets of quaint Kingsport, the hoary gambrel roofs of ancient and witch-haunted Arkham, and the blessed miles of meads and valleys where stone walls rambled and white farmhouse gables peeped out from bowers of verdure. These things he told Randolph Carter, but still the seeker held to his purpose. And in the end they parted each with his own conviction, and Carter went back through the bronze gate into Sci-fi and down the street of the pillars to the old sea-wall, where he talked more of the mariners of far parts and waited for the dark ship from cold and twilight Inganok, whose strange-faced sailors and onyx traders had in them the blood of the great ones. One starlight evening, when the Pharos shone splendid over the harbour, the longed-for ship put in, and strange-faced sailors and traders appeared one by one and group by group in the ancient taverns along the sea-wall. It was very exciting to see again those living faces so like the godlike features on Granick, but Carter did not hasten to speak with the silent seaman. He did not know how much of pride and secrecy and dim, supernal memory might fill those children of the Great Ones, and was sure it would not be wise to tell them of his quest or ask too closely of that cold desert stretching north of the Twilight Land. They asked little with the other folk in those ancient sea taverns, but would gather in groups in remote corners and sing among themselves the haunting airs of unknown places, or chant long tales to one another in accents alien to the rest of Dreamland. And so rare and moving were those airs and tales that one might guess their wonders from the faces of those who listened, even though the words came to common ears only as strange cadence and obscure melody. For a week the strange seamen lingered in the taverns and traded in the bazaars of Sci-fi, and before they sailed Carter had taken passage on their ship, telling them that he was an old onyx miner and wishful to work in their quarries. That ship was very lovely and cunningly wrought, being of teak wood and with ebony fittings and traceries of gold, and the cabin in which the traveller lodged had hangings of silken velvet. One morning at the turn of the tide the sails were raised and the anchor lifted, and as Carter stood on the high stern he saw the sunrise blazing walls and bronze statues and golden minarets of ageless Sci-fi sink into the distance, and the snowy peak of Mount Aran grow smaller and smaller. By noon there was nothing in sight save the gentle blue of the Serenarian Sea, with one painted galley afar off bound for that cloud-hung realm of Serenarian, where the sea meets the sky. And night came with the gorgeous stars, and the dark ship steered for Charles Wain and the Little Bear as they swung slowly around the pole. And the sailors sang strange songs of unknown places, and then stole off one by one to the forecastle, while the wistful watchers murmured old chants and leaned over the rail to glimpse the luminous fish playing in bowers beneath the sea. Carter went to sleep at midnight and rose in the glow of a young morning, marking that of sun, seeming farther south than was its wont. And all through that second day he made progress in knowing the men of the ship, getting them little by little to talk of their cold twilight land, of their exquisite onyx city, and of their fear of the high and impassable peaks beyond which Leng was said to be. They told him how sorry they were that no cats would stay in the land of Inganok, and how they thought the hidden nearness of Leng was to blame for it. Only of the stony deserts to the north they would not talk. There was something disquieting about that desert, and it was thought expedient not to admit its existence. On later days they talked of the quarries in which Carter said he was going to work. There were many of them, for all the city of Inganok was builded on onyx, whilst great polished blocks of it were traded in Rhina, Ograthan, and Sci-fi, and at home with the merchants of Thra, Ilanek, and Cadarathon, for the beautiful wares of those fabulous ports. And far to the north, almost in that cold desert whose existence the men of Inganok did not care to admit, there was an unused quarry, greater than all the rest, from which had been hewn in forgotten times such prodigious lumps and blocks that the sight of their chiselled vacancies struck terror to all who beheld. Who had mined those incredible blocks, and whither they had been transported, no man might say, but it was thought best not to trouble that quarry, around which such inhuman memories might conceivably cling. So it was left all alone in the twilight, with only the raven and the rumoured shantak bird to brood on its immensities. When Carter heard of this quarry, he was moved to deep thought, for he knew from old tales that the Great One's castle atop Unknown Kadath is of onyx. Each day the sun wheeled lower and lower in the sky, and the mists overhead grew thicker and thicker. And in 2 weeks there was not only any sunlight at all, but only a weird grey twilight shining through a dome of eternal cloud by day, and the cold starless phosphorescence from the underside of that cloud by night. On the 20th day, a great jagged rock in the sea was sighted from afar, the first land glimpse since Aran's snowy peak had dwindled behind the ship. Carter asked the captain the name of that rock, but was told that it had no name and had never been sought by any vessel because of the sounds that came from it at night. And when after dark a dull and ceaseless howling arose from that jagged granite place, the traveller was glad that no stop had been made and that the rock had no name. The seaman prayed and chanted till the noise was out of earshot, and Carter dreamed terrible dreams within dreams in the small hours. 2 mornings after that there loomed far ahead and to the east a line of great grey peaks, whose tops were lost in the changeless clouds of that twilight world. And at the sight of them the sailors sang glad songs, and some knelt down on the deck to pray, so that Carter knew they were coming to the land of Inganok and would soon be moored to the basalt quays of the great town bearing that land's name. Toward noon a dark coastline appeared, and before 3 o'clock there stood out against the north the bulbous domes and fantastic spires of the Onyx City. Rare and curious did that archaic city rise above its walls and quays, all of delicate black with scrolls, flutings and arabesques of inlaid gold. Tall and many windowed were the houses, and carved on every side with flowers and patterns whose dark symmetries dazzled the eye with a beauty more poignant than light. Some ended in swelling domes that tapered to a point, others in terraced pyramids whereon rose clustered minarets displaying every phase of strangeness and imagination. The walls were low and pierced by frequent gates, each under a great arch rising high above the general level and capped by the head of a god chiselled with that same skill displayed in the monstrous face on distant granite. On a hill in the centre rose a 16-angled tower, greater than all the rest and bearing a high pinnacled belfry resting on a flattened dome. This, the seaman said, was the temple of the Elder Ones and was ruled by the old high priest, sad with inner secrets. At intervals the clang of a strange bell shivered over the Onyx City, answered each time by a peal of mystic music made up of horns, viols, and chanting voices, and from a row of tripods on the gallery round the high dome of the temple there burst flares of flame at certain moments, for the priests and people of that city were wise in the primal mysteries and faithful in keeping the rhythms of the Great Ones as set forth in scrolls older than the narcotic manuscripts. As the ship rode past the great basalt breakwater into the harbour, the lesser noises of the city grew manifest, and Carter saw the slaves, sailors and merchants of the docks. The sailors and merchants were of the strange-faced race of the gods, but the slaves were squat, slant-eyed folks said by rumour to have drifted somehow across or around the impassable peaks from valleys beyond Leng. The wharfs reached wide outside the city wall and bore upon them all manner of merchandise from the galleys anchored there, while at one end were great piles of onyx both carved and uncarved, awaiting shipment to the far markets of Rhina, Ograthan, and Seliphe. It was not yet evening when the dark ship anchored beside a jutting quay of stone, and all the sailors and traders filed ashore and through the arched gate into the city. The streets of that city were paved with onyx, and some of them were wide and straight, whilst others were crooked and narrow. The houses near the water were lower than the rest, and bore above their curiously arched doorways certain signs of gold, said to be in honour of the respective small gods that favoured each. The captain of the ship took Carter to an old sea tavern where flocked the mariners of quaint countries, and promised that he would next day show him the wonders of the Twilight City and lead him to the taverns of the onyx miners by the northern wall. And evening fell, and little bronze lamps were lighted, and the sailors of that tavern sang songs of remote places. And when from its higher tower the great bell shivered over the city, and the peal of the horns and viols and voices rose cryptical in answer theretofore, all ceased their songs or tales and bowed silent till the last echo died away. For there is a wonder and a strangeness on the Twilight City of Inganok, and men fear to be lax in its rites, lest a doom and a vengeance lurk unsuspectedly close. Far in the shadows of that tavern, Carter saw a squat form he did not like, for it was unmistakably that of the old slant-eyed merchant he had seen so long before in the taverns of Dyleth-Leen, who was reputed to trade with the horrible stone villages of Leng, which no healthy folk visit, or whose evil fires are seen at night from afar. And even to have dealt with that high priest not to be described, which wears a yellow silken mask over its face and dwells all alone in a prehistoric stone monastery. This man had seemed to show a queer gleam of knowing when Carter asked the traders of Dyleth-Leen about the cold waste and Kadath, and somehow his presence in dark and haunted Inganok, so close to the wonders of the north, was not a reassuring thing. He slipped wholly out of sight before Carter could speak to him, and sailors later said that he had come with a yak caravan from some port not well determined, bearing the colossal and rich flavoured eggs of the rumoured shantak bird, to trade for the dexterous jade goblets that merchants brought from Ilanek. On the following morning, the ship captain led Carter through the onyx streets of Inganok, dark under their twilight sky. The inlaid doors and figured house fronts, carven balconies and crystal-paned oriels, all gleamed with a sombre and polished loveliness, and now and then a plaza would open out with black pillars, colonnades, and the statues of curious beings, both human and fabulous. Some of the vistas down long and unbending streets, or through side alleys and over bulbous domes, spires, and arabesqued roofs, were weird and beautiful beyond words, and nothing was more splendid than the massive height of the great central temple of the Elder Ones with its 16 carven sides, its flattened dome, and its lofty pinnacled belfry overtopping all else and majestic whatever its foreground. And always to the east, far beyond the city walls and the leagues of pasture land, rose the gaunt grey sides of those topless and impassable peaks across which hideous Leng was said to lie. The captain took Carter to the mighty temple, which is set with its walled garden in a great round plaza, whence the streets go as spokes from a wheel's hub. The 7 arched gates of that garden, each having over it a carven face like those on the city's gates, are always open, and the people roam reverently at will down the tiled paths and through the little lanes lined with grotesque termini and the shrines of modest gods. And there are fountains, pools, and basins there to reflect the frequent blaze of the tripods on the high balcony, all of onyx and having in them small luminous fish taken by divers from the lower bowers of ocean. When the deep clang from the temple's belfry shivers over the garden and the city, and the answer of the horns and viols and voices peals out from the 7 lodges by the garden gates, there issue from the 7 doors of the temple long columns of masked and hooded priests in black, bearing at arm's length before them great golden bowls from which a curious stream rises. And all the 7 columns strut peculiarly in single file, legs thrown far forward without bending the knees, down the walks that lead to the 7 lodges, wherein they disappear and do not appear again. It is said that the subterranean paths connect the lodges with the temple, and that the long files of priests return through them, nor is it unwhispered that deep flights of onyx steps go down to mysteries that are never told. But only a few are those who hint that the priests in the masked and hooded columns are not human priests. Carter did not enter the temple because none but the veiled king is permitted to do that, but before he left the garden the hour of the bell came, and he heard the shivering clang deafeningly above him, and the wailing of the horns and viols and voices loud from the lodges by the gates. And down the 7 great walks stalked the long files of bowl-bearing priests in their singular way, giving to the traveller a fear which human priests do not often give. When the last of them had vanished, he left that garden, noting as he did so a spot on the pavement over which the bowls had passed. Even the ship captain did not like that spot, and hurried him on toward the hill whereon the veiled king's palace rises many-domed and marvellous. The ways to the onyx palace are steep and narrow, but all that broad curving one, where the king and his companions ride on yaks or in yak-drawn chariots. Carter and his guide climbed up an alley that was all steps, between inlaid walls bearing strange signs in gold, and under balconies and oriels, whence sometimes floated soft strains of music or breaths of exotic fragrance. Always ahead loomed those Titan walls, mighty buttresses, and clustered and bulbous domes for which the veiled king's palace is famous. And at length they passed under a great black arch and emerged in the gardens of the monarch's pleasure. There Carter paused in faintness at so much of beauty, for the onyx terraces and colonnaded walks, the gay parterres and delicate flowering trees, espalier to golden lattices, the barren urns and tripods with cunning bas-reliefs, the pedestaled and almost breathing statues of veined black marble, the basalt-bottomed lagoons and tiled fountains with luminous fish, the tiny temples of iridescent, singing birds atop carven columns, the marvellous scrollwork of the great bronze gates, and the blossoming vines trained along every inch of the polished walls, all joined to form a sight whose loveliness was beyond reality, and half fabulous even in the land of dream. There it shimmered like a vision under that grey twilight sky, with the domed and fretted magnificence of the palace ahead, and the fantastic silhouette of the distant impassable peaks on the right. And ever the small birds and the fountains sang, while the perfume of rare blossoms spread like a veil over that incredible garden. No other human presence was there, and Carter was glad it was so. Then they turned and descended again the onyx alley of steps. For the palace itself no visitor may enter, and it is not well to look too long and steadily at the great central dome, since it is said to house the archaic father of all the rumoured shantak birds, and to send out queer dreams to the curious. After that the captain took Carter to the north quarter of the town, near the gate of the caravans, where the taverns of the yak merchants and the onyx miners are. And there, in the low-ceiled inn of quarrymen, they said farewell, for business called the captain whilst Carter was eager to talk with miners about the north. There were many men in that inn, and the traveller was not long in speaking to some of them, saying that he was an old miner of onyx, and anxious to know somewhat of Inganok's quarries. But all that he learned was not much more than he knew before, for the miners were timid and evasive about the cold desert to the north and the quarry that no man visits. They had fears of fabled emissaries from around the mountains where Leng is said to lie, and of evil presences and nameless sentinels far north among the scattered rocks. And they whispered also that the rumoured shantak birds are no wholesome things, it being indeed for the best that no man has ever truly seen one, for that fabled father of shantaks in the king's dome is fed in the dark. The next day, saying that he wished to look over all the various mines for himself, and to visit the scattered farms and quaint onyx villages of Inganok, Carter hired a yak and stuffed great leathern saddlebags for a journey. Beyond the gate of the caravans the road lay straight betwixt tilled fields, with many odd farmhouses crowned by low domes. At some of these houses the seeker stopped to ask questions, once finding a host so austere and reticent and so full of an unplaced majesty like that in the huge features of Granek that he felt certain he had come at last upon one of the great ones themselves, or upon one with full 9/10 of their blood, dwelling amongst men. And to that austere and reticent Carter he was careful to speak very well of the gods, and to praise all the blessings they had ever accorded him. That night Carter camped in a roadside meadow beneath a great ligath tree, to which he tied his yak, and in the morning resumed his northward pilgrimage. At about 10 o'clock he reached the small domed village of Urg, where traders rest and miners tell their tales, and paused in its taverns till noon. It is here that the great caravan road turns west towards Ceylon, but Carter kept on north by the quarry road. All the afternoon he followed that rising road, which was somewhat narrower than the great highway, and which now led through a region with more rocks than tilled fields. And by evening the low hills on his left had risen into sizable black cliffs, so that he knew he was close to the mining country. All the while the great gaunt sides of the impassable mountains towered afar off at his right, and the farther he went, the worse tales he heard of them from the scattered farmers and traders and drivers of lumbering onyx carts along the way. On the second night he camped in the shadow of a large black crag, tethering his yak to a stake driven in the ground. He observed the greater phosphorescence of the clouds at this northerly point, and more than once thought he saw dark shapes outlined against them. And on the third morning he came in sight of the first onyx quarry and greeted the men who there laboured with picks and chisels. Before evening he had passed 11 quarries, the land being here given altogether over to the onyx cliffs and boulders, with no vegetation at all, but only great rocky fragments scattered about a floor of black earth, with the grey, impassable peaks always rising gaunt and sinister on his right. The third night he spent in a camp of quarrymen whose flickering fires cast weird reflections on the polished cliff to the west. And they sang many songs and told many tales, showing such strange knowledge of the olden days and the habits of gods that Carter could see they held many latent memories of their sires, the great ones. They asked him whither he went, and cautioned him not to go too far to the north, but he replied that he was seeking new cliffs of onyx, and would take no more risks than were common among prospectors. In the morning he bade them adieu and rode on into the darkening north, where they had warned him he would find the feared and unvisited quarry, whence hands older than men's hands had wrenched prodigious blocks. But he did not like it when, turning back to wave at last a last farewell, he thought he saw approaching the camp that squat and evasive old merchant with slanting eyes, whose conjectured traffic with Leng was the gossip of distant Dilith Leen. After 2 more quarries, the inhabitant part of Inganuk seemed to end, and the road narrowed to a steeply rising yak path among forbidding black cliffs. Always on the right towered the gaunt and distant peaks, and as Carter climbed farther and farther into this untraversed realm, he found it grew darker and colder. Soon he perceived that there were no prints of feet or hooves on the black path beneath, and realized that he was indeed come into strange and deserted ways of elder time. Once in a while a raven would croak far overhead, and now and then a flapping behind some vast rock would make him think uncomfortably of the rumoured shantak bird. But in the main he was alone with his shaggy steed, and it troubled him to observe that this excellent yak became more and more reluctant to advance, and more disposed to snort affrightedly at any small noise along the route. The path now contracted between sable and glistening walls, and began to display an even greater steepness than before. It was a bad footing, and the yak often slipped on the stony fragments strewn thickly about. In 2 hours Carter saw ahead a definite crest, beyond which was nothing but grey, dull sky, and blessed the prospect of a level or downward course. To reach this crest, however, was not an easy task, for the way had grown nearly perpendicular, and was perilous with loose black gravel and small stones. Eventually Carter dismounted and led his dubious yak, pulling very hard when the animal balked or stumbled, and kept his own footing as best he might. Then suddenly he came to the top and saw beyond, and gasped at what he saw. The path indeed led straight ahead and slightly down, with the same lines of high natural walls as before, but on the left hand there opened out a monstrous space, vast acres in extent, where some archaic power had riven and rent the native cliffs of onyx in the form of a giant's quarry. Far back into the solid precipice ran the Cyclopean Gauge, and deep down within Earth's bowels its lower delvings yawned. It was no quarry of man, and the concave sides were scarred with great squares yards wide which told of the size of the blocks once hewn by nameless hands and chisels. High over its jagged rim huge ravens flapped and croaked, and vague whirrings in the unseen depths told of bats or urhags, or less mentionable presences haunting the endless blackness. There Carter stood in the narrow way amidst the twilight of the rocky path sloping down before him. Tall onyx cliffs on the right that led on as far as he could see, and tall cliffs on the left chopped off just ahead to make that terrible and unearthly quarry. All at once the yak uttered a cry and burst from his control, leaping past him and darting on in a panic, till it vanished down the narrow slope toward the north. Stones kicked by its flying hooves fell over the brink of the quarry and lost themselves in the dark without any sound of striking bottom, but Carter ignored the perils of that scanty path as he raced breathlessly after the flying steed. Soon the left-hand cliffs resumed their course, making the way once more a narrow lane, and still the traveller leaped on after the yak, whose great wide prints told of its desperate flight. Once he thought he heard the hoof-beats of the frightened beasts, and doubled his speed from this encouragement. He was covering miles, and little by little the way was broadening in front till he knew he must soon emerge on the cold and dreaded desert to the north. The gaunt grey flanks of the distant impassable peaks were again visible above the right-hand crags, and ahead were the rocks and boulders of an open space which was clearly a foretaste of the dark and limitless plain. And once more those hoofbeats sounded in his ears, plainer than before, but this time giving terror instead of encouragement, because he realized that they were not the frightened hoofbeats of his fleeing yak. These beats were ruthless and purposeful, and they were behind him. Carter's pursuit of the yak became now a flight from an unseen thing, for though he dared not glance over his shoulder, he felt that the presence behind him could be nothing wholesome or mentionable. His yak must have heard or felt it first, and he did not like to ask himself whether it had followed him from the haunts of men or had floundered up out of that black quarry pit. Meanwhile, the cliffs had been left behind, so that the oncoming night fell over a great waste of sand and spectral rocks, wherein all paths were lost. He could not see the hoofprints of his yak, but always from behind him there came that detestable clopping, mingled now and then with what he fancied were titanic flappings and whirrings. That he was losing ground seemed unhappily clear to him, and he knew he was hopelessly lost in this broken and blasted desert of meaningless rocks and untravelled sands. Only those remote and impassable peaks on the right gave him any sense of direction, and even they were less clear as the grey twilight waned and the sickly phosphorescence of the clouds took its place. Then, dim and misty in the darkling north before him, he glimpsed a terrible thing. He had thought it, for some moments, a range of black mountains, but now he saw it was something more. The phosphorescence of the brooding clouds showed it plainly, and even silhouetted parts of it as low vapours glowed behind. How distant it was he could not tell, but it must have been very far. It was thousands of feet high, stretching in a great concave arc from the grey, impassable peaks of the unimagined westward spaces, and had once indeed been a ridge of mighty onyx hills. But now those hills were hills no more, for some hand greater than man's had touched them. Silent they squatted there atop the world like wolves or ghouls, crowned with clouds and mists and guarding the secrets of the north forever. All in a great half-circle they squatted, those dog-like mountains carven into monstrous watching statues, and their right hands were raised in menace against mankind. It was only the flickering light of the clouds that made their mitred double heads seem to move, but as Carter stumbled on, he saw arise from their shadowy laps great forms whose motions were no delusion. Winged and whirring, those forms grew larger each moment, and the traveller knew his stumbling was at an end. They were not any birds or bats known elsewhere on earth or in dreamland, for they were larger than elephants and had heads like horses. Carter knew that they must be the shantak birds of ill rumour, and wondered no more what evil guardians and nameless sentinels made men avoid the boreal rock desert. And as he stopped in final resignation, he dared at last to look behind him, where indeed was trotting the squat slant-eyed trader of evil legend, grinning astride a lean yak, and leading on a noxious horde of leering shantaks, to whose wings still clung the rime and nitra of the nether pits. Trapped though he was by fabulous and hippocephalic winged nightmares that pressed around in great unholy circles, Randolph Carter did not lose consciousness. Lofty and horrible those titan gargoyles towered above him, while the slant-eyed merchants leaped down from his yak and stood grinning before the captive. Then the man motioned Carter to mount one of the repugnant shantaks, helping him up as his judgment struggled with his loathing. It was hard work ascending, for the shantak bird has scales instead of feathers, and those scales are very slippery. Once he was seated, the slant-eyed man hopped up behind him, leaving the lean yak to be led away northward toward the ring of carven mountains by one of the incredible bird colossi. There now followed a hideous world through frigid space, endlessly up and eastward toward the gaunt grey flanks of those impassable mountains beyond which Leng was said to lie. Far above the clouds they flew, till at last there lay beneath them those fabled summits which the folk of Inganok have never seen, and which lie always in high vortices of gleaming mist. Carter beheld them very plainly as they passed below, and saw upon their topmost peaks strange caves which made him think of those of Granite, but he did not question his captor about these things when he noticed that both the man and the horse-headed Shantank appeared oddly fearful of them, hurrying past nervously and showing great tension until they were left far in the rear. The Shantak now flew lower, revealing beneath the canopy of cloud a grey, barren plain whereon at great distances shone little feeble fires. As they descended there appeared at intervals lone huts of granite and bleak stone villages whose tiny windows glowed with pallid light, and there came from those huts and villages a shrill droning of pipes and a nauseous rattle of crotala, which proved at once that Inganok's people are right in their geographic rumours. For travellers have heard such sounds before, and know that they float only from the cold desert plateau which healthy folk never visit, that haunted place of evil and mystery which is Leng. Around the feeble fires dark forms were dancing, and Carter was curious as to what manner of beings they might be, for no healthy folk have ever been to Leng, and the place is known only by its fires and stone huts as seen from afar. Very slowly and awkwardly did those forms leap, and with an insane twisting and bending not good to behold, so that Carter did not wonder at the monstrous evil imputed to them by vague legend, or the fear in which all dreamland holds their abhorrent frozen plateau. As the Shantank flew lower, the repulsiveness of the dancers became tinged with a certain hellish familiarity, and the prisoner kept straining his eyes and racking his memory for clues to where he had seen such creatures before. They leaped as though they had hooves instead of feet, and seemed to wear a sort of wig or headpiece with small horns. Of other clothing they had none, but most of them were quite furry. Behind they had dwarfish tails, and when they glanced upward he saw the excessive width of their mouths. Then he knew what they were, and that they did not wear any wigs or headpieces after all. For the cryptic folk of Leng were of one race with the uncomfortable merchants of the Black Galleys and traded rubies of Dilithleen, those not quite human merchants who are the slaves of the monstrous moon things. They were indeed the same dark folk who had shanghaied Carter on their noisy galley so long ago, and whose kith he had seen driven in herds about the unclean wharfs of that accursed lunar city, with the leaner ones toiling and the fatter ones taken away in crates for other needs of their polypus and amorphous masters. Now he saw where such ambiguous creatures came from, and shuddered at the thought that Leng must be known to these formless abominations from the moon. But the Shantak flew on past the fires and the shore huts and the less-than-human dancers, and soared over the sterile hills of grey granite and dim wastes of rock and ice and snow. Day came, and the phosphorescence of low clouds gave place to the misty twilight of that northern world, and still the vile bird winged meaningly through the cold and silence. At times the slant-eyed man talked with his steed in a hateful and guttural language, and the Shantak would answer with tittering tones that rasped like the scratchings of ground glass. All this while the land was getting higher, and finally they came to a windswept tableland which seemed the very roof of a blasted and tenantless world. There, all alone in the hush and the dusk and the cold, rose the uncouth stones of a squat, windowless building around which a circle of crude monoliths stood. In all this arrangement there was nothing human, and Carter surmised from old tales that he was indeed come to that most dreadful and legendary of all places, the remote and prehistoric monastery wherein dwells uncompanioned the high priest not to be described, which wears a yellow silken mask over its face and prays to the other gods and their crawling chaos Nyarlathotep. The loathsome bird now settled on the ground, and the slant-eyed man hopped down and helped his captive alight. Of the purpose of his seizure Carter now felt very sure, for clearly the slant-eyed merchant was an agent of the darker powers, eager to drag before his masters a mortal whose presumption had aimed at the finding of unknown Kadath and the saying of a prayer before the faces of the great ones in their onyx castle. It seemed likely that this merchant had caused his former capture by the slaves of the moon things in Dilith Leen, and that he now meant to do what the rescuing cats had baffled, talking the victim to some dread rendezvous with monstrous Nyarlathotep, and telling with what boldness the seeking of unknown Kadath had been tried. Leng and the cold waste north of Inganok must be close to the other gods, and there the passes of Kadath are well guarded. The slant-eyed man was small, but the great hippocephalic bird was there to see he was obeyed. So Carter followed where he led, and passed within the circle of standing rocks and into the low, arched doorway of that windowless stone monastery. There were no lights inside, but the devil merchant lit a small clay lamp bearing morbid bas-reliefs and prodded his prisoner on through mazes of narrow, winding corridors. On the walls of the corridors were painted frightful scenes older than history, and in a style unknown to the archaeologists of Earth. After countless aeons their pigments were brilliant still, for the cold and dryness of hideous Leng kept alive many primal things. Carter saw them fleetingly in the rays of that dim and moving lamp, and shuddered at the tale they told. Through those archaic frescoes Leng's annals stalked, and the horned-hooved and wide-mouthed almost humans danced evilly amidst forgotten cities. There were scenes of old wars wherein Leng's almost humans fought with the bloated purple spiders of the neighbouring vales, and there were scenes also of the coming of the black galleys from the moon, and of the submission of Leng's people to the polypus and the amorphous blasphemies that hopped and floundered and wriggled out of them. Those slippery greyish-white blasphemies they worshipped as gods, nor ever complained when scores of their best and fatted males were taken away in the black galleys. The monstrous moon beasts made their camp on a jagged isle in the sea, and Carter could tell from the frescoes that this was none other than the lone nameless rock he had seen when sailing to Inganok, that grey accursed rock which Inganok's seamen shun, and from which vile howlings reverberate all through the night. And in those frescoes was shown the great seaport and capital of the almost humans, proud and pillared betwixt the cliffs and the basalt wharfs, and wondrous with high fanes and carven places. Great gardens and column streets led from the cliffs and from each other of the 6 sphinx-crowned gates to a vast central plaza, and in that plaza was a pair of winged colossal lions guarding the top of a subterranean staircase. Again and again were those huge winged lions shown, their mighty flanks of diorite glistening in the grey twilight of the day and the cloudy phosphorescence of the night. And as Carter stumbled past their frequent and repeated pictures, it came to him at last what, indeed, they were, and what city it was that the almost humans had ruled so anciently before the coming of the black galleys. There could be no mistake, for the legends of Dreamland are generous and profuse. Indubitably, that primal city was no less a place than storied Sarkomend, whose ruins had bleached for 1,000,000 years before the first true humans saw the light, and whose twin titan lions guard eternally the steps that led down from Dreamland to the Great Abyss. Other views showed the gaunt grey peaks dividing Leng from Inganok and the monstrous Shantak birds that build nests on the ledges halfway up, and they showed likewise the curious caves near the very topmost pinnacles, and how even the boldest of the Shantaks fly screaming away from them. Carter had seen those caves when he passed over them, and had noticed their likeness to the caves on Granek. Now he knew that the likeness was more than a chance one, for in these pictures were shown their fearsome denizens, and those bat wings, curving horns, barbed tails, prehensile paws, and rubbery bodies were not strange to him. He had met those silent, flitting and clutching creatures before, those mindless guardians of the great abyss, whom even the great ones fear, and who own not Nyarlathotep, but hoary Nodens as their lord. For they were the dreaded night gaunts, who never laugh or smile because they have no faces, and who flop unendingly in the dark betwixt the vale of Naf and the passes to the outer world. The slant-eyed merchant had now prodded Carter into a great domed space whose walls were carved in shocking bas-reliefs, and whose centre held a gaping circular pit surrounded by 6 malignly stained stone altars in a ring. There was no light in this vast and evil-smelling crypt, and the small lamp of the sinister merchant shone so feebly that one could grasp details only little by little. At the farther end was a high stone dais, reached by 5 steps, and there on a golden throne sat a lumpish figure robed in yellow silk figured with red and having a yellow silken mask over its face. To this being the slant-eyed man made certain signs with his hands, and the lurker in the dark replied by raising a disgustingly carven flute of ivory in silk-covered paws and blowing certain loathsome sounds from beneath its flowing yellow mask. This colloquy went on for some time, and to Carter there was something sickeningly familiar in the sound of that flute and the stench of the malodorous place. It made him think of a frightful red-litten city, of the revolting procession that once filed through it, of that and of an awful climb through lunar countryside beyond, before the rescuing rush of Earth's friendly cats. He knew that the creature on the dais was, without doubt, the high priest not to be described, of which legend whispers such fiendish and abnormal possibilities, but he feared to think just what that abhorred high priest might be. Then the figured silk slipped a trifle from one of the greyish-white paws, and Carter knew what the noisome high priest was. And in that hideous second, stark fear drove him to something his reason would never have dared to attempt, for in all his shaken consciousness there was room only for one frantic will to escape from what squatted on that golden throne. He knew that hopeless labyrinths of stone lay betwixt him and the cold tableland outside, and that even on that tableland the noxious Shantak still waited. Yet in spite of all this, there was in his mind only the instant need to get away from that wriggling, silk-robed monstrosity. The slant-eyed man had set his curious lamp upon one of the high and wickedly stained altar stones by the pit, and had moved forward somewhat to talk to the high priest with his hands. Carter, hitherto wholly passive, now gave that man a terrific push with all the wild strength of fear, so that the victim toppled at once into that gaping well which rumour holds to reach down to the hellish vaults of Zin, where Gugs hunt ghasts in the dark. In almost the same second he seized the lamp from the altar and darted out into the frescoed labyrinths, racing his way, and that as chance determined, and trying not to think of the stealthy padding of shapeless paws on the stones behind him, or of the silent wrigglings and crawlings which must be going on back there in lightless corridors. After a few moments he regretted his thoughtless haste and wished he had tried to follow backward the frescoes he had passed on the way in. True, they were so confused and duplicated that they could not have done him much good, but he wished nonetheless he had made the attempt. Those he now saw were even more horrible than those he had seen then, and he knew he was not in the corridors leading outside. In time he became quite sure he was not followed, and slackened his pace somewhat, but scarce had he breathed in half relief when a new peril beset him. His lamp was waning, and he would soon be in pitch blackness with no means of sight or guidance. When the light was all gone, he groped slowly in the dark and prayed to the great ones for such help as they might afford. At times he felt the stone floor sloping up or down, and once he stumbled over a step for which no reason seemed to exist. The farther he went, the damper it seemed to be, and when he was able to feel a junction or the mouth of a side passage, he always chose the way which sloped downward the least. He believed, though, that his general course was down, and the vault-like smell and incrustations on the greasy walls and floor alike warned him of the thing which came at last. Only the thing itself, with its terror and shock and breathtaking chaos. One moment he was groping slowly over the slippery floor of an almost level place, and the next he was shooting dizzily downward in the dark through a burrow which must have been well nigh vertical. Of the length of that hideous sliding he could never be sure, but it seemed to take hours of delirious nausea and ecstatic frenzy. Then he realized he was still, with the phosphorescent clouds of a northern night shining sickly above him. All around were crumbling walls and broken columns, and the pavement on which he lay was pierced by straggling grass and wrenched asunder by frequent shrubs and roots. Behind him a basalt cliff rose topless and perpendicular, its dark side sculptured into repellent scenes and pierced by an arched and carven entrance to the inner blacknesses out of which he had come. Ahead stretched double rows of pillars and the fragments and pedestals of pillars that spoke to a broad and bygone street, and from the urns and basins along the way he knew it had been a great street of gardens. Far off at its end the pillars spread to mark a vast round plaza, and in that open circle there loomed gigantic, under the lurid night clouds, a pair of monstrous things. Huge winged lions of diorite they were, with blackness and shadow between them. Full 20 feet they reared their grotesque and unbroken heads and snarled derisive on the ruins around them. And Carter knew right well what they must be, for legend tells of only one such twain. They were the changeless guardians of the great abyss, and these dark ruins were in truth primordial Sarkomand. Carter's first act was to close and barricade the archway in the cliff with fallen blocks and odd debris that lay around. He wished no follower from Leng's hateful monastery, for along the way ahead would lurk enough of the other dangers. Of how to get from Sarkomand to the peopled parts of Dreamland he knew nothing at all, nor could he gain much by descending to the grottos of the Gauls, since he knew they were no better informed than he. The 3 Gauls which had helped him through the city of Gargs to the outer world had not known how to reach Sarkomand in their journey back, but had planned to ask old traders in Dilithleen. He did not like to think of going again to the subterranean world of Gargs, and risking once more that hellish tower of Koth with its cyclopean steps leading to the enchanted wood, yet he felt he might have to try this course if all else failed. Over Leng's plateau past the lone monastery he dared not go unaided, for the high priest's emissaries must be many, while at the journey's end there would be no doubt the Shantaks, and perhaps other things to deal with. If he could get a boat, he might sail back to Inganok, past the jagged and hideous rock in the sea, for the primal frescoes in the monastery labyrinth had shown that this frightful place lies not far from Sarkerman's basalt quays. But to find a boat in this aeon-deserted city was no probable thing, and it did not appear likely that he could ever make one. Such were the thoughts of Randolph Carter when a new impression began beating upon his mind. All this while, there had stretched before him the great corpse-like width of fabled Sarkerman with its black, broken pillars and crumpling sphinx-crowned gates and titan stones and monstrous winged lions against the sickly glow of those luminous night clouds. Now he saw far ahead and on the right a glow that no clouds could account for, and knew he was not alone in the silence of that dead city. The glow rose and fell fitfully, flickering with a greenish tinge which did not reassure the watcher. And when he crept closer down the littered street and through some narrow gaps between tumbled walls, he perceived that it was a campfire near the wharfs with many vague forms clustered darkly around it, and a lethal odour hanging heavily over all. Beyond was the oily lapping of the harbour water with a great ship riding at anchor, and Carter paused in stark terror when he saw that the ship was indeed one of the dreaded black galleys from the moon. Then, just as he was about to creep back from that detestable flame, he saw a stirring among the vague dark forms and heard a peculiar and unmistakable sound. It was the frightened meeping of a ghoul, and in a moment it had swelled to a veritable chorus of anguish. Secure as he was in the shadow of monstrous ruins, Carter allowed his curiosity to conquer his fear, and crept forward again, instead of retreating. Once in crossing an open street, he wriggled worm-like on his stomach, and in another place he had to rise to his feet to avoid making a noise among heaps of fallen marble. But always he succeeded in avoiding discovery, so that in a short time he had found a spot behind a titan pillar whence he could watch the whole green-litten scene of action. There, around a hideous fire fed by the obnoxious stems of lunar fungi, there squatted a stinking circle of the toad-like moon beasts and their almost human slaves. Some of these slaves were heating curious iron spears in the leaping flames, and at intervals applying their white-hot points to 3 tightly trussed prisoners that lay writhing before the leaders of the party. From the motions of their tentacles, Carter could see that the blunt-snouted moonbeasts were enjoying the spectacle hugely, and vast was his horror when he suddenly recognized the frantic meeping and knew that the tortured ghouls were none other than the faithful trio who had guided him safely from the abyss and had thereafter set out from the enchanted wood to find Sarkerman and the gate to their native deeps. The number of the malodorous moon beasts about that greenish fire was very great, and Carter saw that he could do nothing now to save his former allies. Of how the ghouls had been captured he could not guess, but fancied that the grey toad-like blasphemies had heard them inquire in Dilith Leen concerning the way to Sarkerman and had not wished them to approach so closely the hateful plateau of Leng and the high priest not to be described. For a moment he pondered on what he ought to do, and recalled how near he was to the gate of the ghouls' black kingdom. Clearly it was the wisest to creep east to the plaza of twin lions and descend at once to the gulf, where assuredly he would meet no horrors worse than those above, and where he might soon find ghouls eager to rescue their brethren and perhaps to wipe out the moon beasts from the black galley. It occurred to him that the portal, like other gates to the abyss, might be guarded by flocks of night gaunts, but he did not fear these faceless creatures now. He had learned that they are bound by solemn treaties with the ghouls, and the ghoul which was Pickman had taught him how to glibber, a password they understood. So Carter began another silent crawl through the ruins, edging slowly toward the great central plaza and the winged lions. It was ticklish work, but the moon beasts were pleasantly busy and did not hear the slight noises which he twice made by accident among the scattered stones. At last he reached the open space and picked his way among the stunted trees and briars that had grown up therein. The gigantic lions loomed terrible above him in the sickly glow of the phosphorescent night clouds, and he manfully persisted toward them and presently crept round to their faces, knowing it was on that side he would find the mighty darkness which they guard. 10 feet apart crouched the mocking-faced beasts of Dyrit, brooding on cyclopean pedestals whose sides were chiselled into fearsome bas-reliefs. Betwixt them was a tiled court, with a central space which had once been railed with balusters of onyx. Midway in this space a black well opened, and Carter soon saw that he had indeed reached the yawning gulf whose crusted and mouldy stone steps led down to the crypts of nightmare. Terrible is the memory of that dark descent in which hours wore themselves away whilst Carter would sightlessly round and round down a fathomless spiral of steep and slippery stairs. So worn and narrow were the steps, and so greasy with the ooze of inner earth, that the climber never quite knew when to expect a breathless fall and hurtling down to the ultimate pits. And he was likewise uncertain just when or how the guardian night gaunts would suddenly pounce upon him, if indeed there were any stationed in this primeval passage. All about him was a stifling odour of nether gulfs, and he felt that the air of these choking depths was not made for mankind. In time he became very numb and somnolent, moving more from automatic impulse than from reasoned will, nor did he realize any change when he stopped moving altogether, as something quietly seized him from behind. He was flying very rapidly through the air before a malevolent tickling told him that the rubbery night gaunts had performed their duty. Awake to the fact that he was in the cold, damp clutch of the faceless flutterers, Carter remembered the password of the ghouls and glibbered it as loudly as he could amidst the wind and chaos of flight. Mindless though night gaunts are said to be, the effect was instantaneous, for all tickling stopped at once, and the creatures hastened to shift their captive to a more comfortable position. Thus encouraged, Carter ventured some explanations, telling of the seizure and torture by 3 ghouls by the moon beasts, and of the need of assembling a party to rescue them. The night gaunts, though inarticulate, seemed to understand what was said, and shown greater haste and purpose in their flight. Suddenly the dense blackness gave place to the grey twilight of inner earth, and there opened up ahead one of those flat sterile plains on which ghouls love to squat and gnaw. Scattered tombstones and osseous fragments told of the denizens of that place, and as Carter gave a loud meep of urgent summons, a score of burrows emptied forth their leathery, dog-like tenants. The night gaunts now fell low and set their passenger upon his feet, afterward withdrawing a little and forming a hunched semicircle on the ground while the ghouls greeted the newcomer. Carter glibbered his message rapidly and explicitly to the grotesque company, and the 4 of them at once departed through different burrows to spread the news to others and gather such troops as might be available for the rescue. After a long wait, a ghoul of some importance appeared and made significant signs to the night gaunts, causing 2 of the latter to fly off into the dark. Thereafter there were constant accessions to the hunched flock of night gaunts on the plain, till at length the slimy soil was fairly black with them. Meanwhile fresh ghouls crawled out of the burrows one by one, all glibbering excitedly and forming in crude battle array not far from the huddled night gaunts. In time there appeared that proud and influential ghoul who was once artist Richard Pickman of Boston, and to him Carter glibbered a very full account of what had occurred. The erstwhile Pickman, surprised to greet his ancient friend again, seemed very much impressed, and held a conference with other chiefs a little apart from the growing throng. Finally, after scanning the ranks with care, the assembled chiefs all meeped in unison and began glibbering orders to the crowds of ghouls and night gaunts. A large detachment of the horned flyers vanished at once, while the rest grouped themselves 2 by 2 on their knees with extended forelegs, awaiting the approach of the ghouls 1 by 1. As each ghoul reached the pair of night gaunts to which he was assigned, he was taken up and borne away into the blackness till, at last, the whole throng had vanished, save for Carter, Pickman, and the other chiefs, and a few pairs of night gaunts. Pickman explained that night gaunts are the advance guard and battle steeds of the ghouls, and that the army was issuing forth to Sarkaman to deal with the moon beasts. Then Carter and the ghoulish chiefs approached the waiting bearers and were taken up by the damp, slippery paws. Another movement, and all were whirling in wind and darkness, endlessly up to the gates of the winged lions and the spectral ruins of primal Sarkamand. When, after a great interval, Carter saw again the sickly light of Sarkamand's nocturnal sky, it was to behold the great central plaza swarming with militant ghouls and night gaunts. They, he felt sure, must be almost due, but so strong was the army that no surprise of the enemy would be needed. The greenish flare near the wharf still glimmered faintly, though the absence of ghoulish meeping showed that the torture of the prisoners was over, for the nonce. Softly glibbering directions to their steeds, and to the flock of riderless night gaunts ahead, the ghouls presently rose in wide whirring columns and sweeping on over the bleak ruins towards the evil flame. Carter was now beside Pickman in the front rank of ghouls, and saw as they approached the noisome camp that the moon beasts were totally unprepared. The 3 prisoners lay bound and inert beside the fire, while their toad-like captors slumped drowsily about in no certain order. The almost human slaves were asleep, even the sentinels shirking a duty, which this realm must have seemed to them merely perfunctory. The final swoop of the night gaunts and mounted ghouls was very sudden, each of the greyish toad-like blasphemies and their almost human slaves being seized by a group of night gaunts before a sound was made. The moon beasts, of course, were voiceless, and even the slaves had little chance to scream before rubbery paws choked them into silence. Horrible were the writhings of those great jealous abnormalities as the sardonic night gaunts clutched them, but nothing availed against the strength of those black, prehensile talons. When a moon beast writhed too violently, a night gaunt would seize and pull its quivering pink tentacles, and it seemed to hurt so much that the victim would cease its struggles. Carter expected to see much slaughter, but found that the ghouls were far subtler in their plans. They glibbered certain simple orders to the night gaunts which held the captives, trusting the rest to instinct, and soon the hapless creatures were borne silently away into the great abyss, to be distributed impartially amongst the bowls, gugs, ghasts, and other dwellers in darkness whose modes of nourishment are not painless to their chosen victims. Meanwhile, the 3 bound ghouls had been released and consoled by their conquering kingsfolk, whilst various parties searched the neighbourhood for possible remaining moon beasts and boarded the evil, smelling black galley at the wharf to make sure that nothing had escaped the general defeat. Surely enough, the capture had been thorough, for not a sign of further life could the victors detect. Carter, anxious to preserve a means of access to the rest of Dreamland, urged them not to sink the anchored galley, and this request was freely granted out of gratitude for his act in reporting the plight of the captured trio. On the ship were found some very curious objects and decorations, some of which Carter cast at once into the sea. Ghouls and night gaunts now formed themselves in separate groups, the former questioning their rescued fellows anent past happenings. It appeared that the three had followed Carter's directions and proceeded from the Enchanted Wood to Dilithleen by way of Ner and the sky, stealing human clothes at a lonely farmhouse and loping as closely as possible in the fashion of a man's walk. In Dilethleen's taverns their grotesque ways and faces had aroused much comment, but they had persisted in asking the way to Sarcomund until at last an old traveller was able to tell them. Then they knew that only a ship for Lila Glang would serve their purpose, and prepared to wait patiently for such a vessel. But evil spies had doubtless reported much, for shortly a black galley put into port, and the wide-mouthed ruby merchants invited the ghouls to drink with them in a tavern. Wine was produced from one of those sinister bottles grotesquely carven from a single ruby, and after that the ghouls found themselves prisoners on the black galleys as Carter had once found himself. This time, however, the unseen rowers steered not for the moon but for antique Sarcomund. Bent evidently on taking their captives before the high priest not to be described, they had touched at a jagged rock in the northern sea which Inganok's mariners shun, and the ghouls had there seen for the first time the real masters of the ship, being sickened despite their own callousness by such extremes of malign shapelessness and fearsome odour. There too were witnessed the nameless pastimes of the toad-like resident garrison, such pastimes as give rise to the night howlings which men fear. After that had come the landing at ruined Sarcomund and the beginning of the tortures, whose continuance the present rescue had prevented. Future plans were next discussed, the three rescued ghouls suggesting a raid on the jagged rock and the extermination of the toad-like garrison there. To this, however, the night gaunts objected, since the prospect of flying over water did not please them. Most of the ghouls favoured the design, but were at a loss how to follow it without the help of the winged night gaunts. Thereupon Carter, seeing that they could not navigate the anchored galley, offered to teach them to use over the great banks of oars, to which proposal they eagerly assented. Grey day had now come, and under that leaden northern sky a picked detachment of ghouls filed into a noisome ship and took their seats on the rowers' benches. Carter found them fairly apt at learning, and before night had risked several experimental trips around the harbour. Not till 3 days later, however, did he deem it safe to attempt the voyage of conquest. Then the rowers trained and the night gaunts safely stowed in the forecastle. The party set sail at last, Pickman and the other chiefs gathering on deck and discussing modes of approach and procedure. On the very first night the howlings from the rock were heard. Such was their timbre that all the galley's crew shook visibly, but most of all trembled the three rescued ghouls who knew precisely what those howlings meant. It was not thought best to attempt an attack by night, so the ship lay to, under the phosphorescent clouds, to wait for the dawn of a greyish day. When the light was ample and the howling still, the rowers resumed their strokes, and the galley drew closer and closer to that jagged rock whose granite pinnacles clawed fantastically at the dull sky. The sides of the rock were very steep, but on ledges here and there could be seen the bulging walls of queer windowless dwellings, and the low railings guarding travelled high roads. No ship of men had ever come so near the place, or at least had never come so near and departed again, but Carter and the ghouls were void of fear and kept inflexibly on, rounding the eastern face of the rock and seeking the wharfs, which the rescued trio described as being on the southern side within a harbour formed of steep headlands. The headlands were prolongations of the island proper, and came so close together that only one ship at a time might pass between them. There seemed to be no watchers on the outside, so the galley was steered boldly through the flume-like strait and into the stagnant, fetid harbour beyond. Here, however, all was bustle and activity, with several ships lying at anchor along a forbidding stone quay, and scores of almost human slaves and moon beasts by the waterfront, handling crates and boxes or driving nameless and fabulous horrors hitched into lumbering lorries. There was a small stone town hewn out of the vertical cliff above the wharfs, with the start of a winding road that spiraled out of sight toward higher ledges of the rock. Of what lay inside that prodigious peak of granite none might say, but the things one saw on the outside were far from encouraging. At sight of the incoming galley, the crowds on the wharfs displayed much eagerness, those with eyes staring intently and those without eyes wriggling their pink tentacles expectantly. They did not, of course, realize that the black ship had changed hands, for ghouls look much like the horned and hooved almost humans, and the night gaunts were all out of sight below. By this time the leaders had fully formed a plan, which was to loose the night gaunts as soon as the wharfs was touched, and then to sail directly away, leaving matters wholly to the instincts of those almost mindless creatures. Marooned on the rock, the horned flyers would first of all seize what living things they found there, and afterward, quite helpless to think except in terms of the homing instinct, would forget their fear of water and fly swiftly back to the abyss, bearing their noisome prey to appropriate destinations in the dark, from which not much would emerge alive. The ghoul that was Pickman now went below and gave the night gaunts their simple instructions, while the ship drew very near to the ominous and malodorous wharfs. Presently a fresh stir rose along the waterfront, and Carter saw that the motions of the galley had begun to excite suspicion. Evidently the steersman was not making for the right dock, and probably the watchers had noticed the difference between the hideous ghouls and the almost human slaves whose places they were taking. Some silent alarm must have been given, for almost at once a horde of the mephitic moon beasts began to pour from the little black doorways of the windowless houses and down the winding road at the right. A rain of curious javelins struck the galley as the prow hit the wharf, felling 2 ghouls and slightly wounding another, but at this point all the hatches were thrown open to emit a black cloud of whirring night gaunts, which swarmed over the town like a flock of horned and cyclopean bats. The jellyish moon beasts had procured a great pole and were trying to push off the invading ship, but when the night gaunt struck them they thought of such things no more. It was a very terrible spectacle to see those faceless and rubbery ticklers at their pastime, and tremendously impressive to watch the dense cloud of them spreading through the town and up the winding roadway to the reaches above. Sometimes a group of the black flutterers would drop a toad-like prisoner from aloft by mistake, and the manner in which the victim would burst was highly offensive to the sight and smell. When the last of the night gaunts had left the galley, the ghoulish leaders glibbered an order of withdrawal, and the rowers pulled quietly out of the harbour between the grey headlands, while still the town was a chaos of battle and conquest. The Pickman ghoul allowed several hours for the night gaunts to make up their rudimentary minds and overcome their fear of flying over the sea, and kept the galley standing about a mile off the jagged rock, while we waited and dressed the wounds of the injured men. Night fell, and the grey twilight gave place to the sickly phosphorescence of low clouds, and all the while the leaders watched the high peaks of that accursed rock for signs of the night gaunt's flight. Toward morning a black speck was seen hovering timidly over the topmost pinnacle, and shortly afterward the speck had become a swarm. Just before daybreak the swarm seemed to scatter, and within a quarter of an hour it had vanished wholly in the distance toward the northeast. Once or twice something seemed to fall from the thinning swarm into the sea, but Carter did not worry, since he knew from observation that the toad-like moon beasts cannot swim. At length, when the ghouls were satisfied that all the night gaunts had left for Sarkomund and the great abyss with their doomed burdens, the galley put back into the harbour betwixt the grey headlands, and all the hideous company landed and roamed curiously over the denuded rock with its towers and eyries and fortresses chiselled from the solid stone. Frightful were the secrets uncovered in those evil and windowless crypts, for the remnants of unfinished pastimes were many, and in various stages of departure from their primal state. Carter put out of the way certain things which were after a fashion alive, and fled precipitately from a few other things about which he could not be very positive. The stench-filled houses were furnished mostly with grotesque stools and benches carven from moon trees, and were painted inside with nameless and frantic designs. Countless weapons, implements, and ornaments lay about, including some large idols of solid ruby depicting singular beings not found on the earth. These latter did not, despite their material, invite either appropriation or long inspection, and Carter took the trouble to hammer 5 of them into very small pieces. The scattered spears and javelins he collected and with Pickman's approval distributed among the Gauls. Such devices were new to the dog-like lopers, but their relative simplicity made them easy to master after a few concise hints. Randolph Carter had hoped to come into the throne room of the Great Ones with poise and dignity, flanked and followed by impressive lines of Gauls in ceremonial order, and offering his prayer as a free and potent master among dreamers. He had known that the Great Ones themselves are not beyond a mortal's power to cope with, and had trusted to luck that the other gods and their crawling chaos Nyarlathotep would not happen to come to their aid at the crucial moment, as they had so often done before when men sought out Earth's gods in their home or on their mountains. And with his hideous escort he had half hoped to defy even the other gods if need were, knowing as he did that Gauls have no masters, and that Nightgaunt's own not Nyarlathotep, but only archaic Nodens for their lord. But now he saw that supernal Kadath in its cold waste is indeed girten with dark wonders and nameless sentinels, than that the other gods are of a surety vigilant in guarding the mild, feeble gods of earth. Void as they are of lordship over Gauls and Nightgaunts, the mindless, shapeless blasphemies of outer space can yet control them when they must, so that it was not in state as a free and potent master of dreamers that Randolph Carter came into the Great One's throne room with his Gauls. Swept and herded by nightmare tempests from the stars and dogged by unseen horrors of the northern waste, all that army floated captive and helpless in the lurid light, dropping numbly to the onyx floor when, by some voiceless order, the winds of fright dissolved. Before no golden days had Randolph Carter come, nor was there any august circle of crowned and haloed beings with narrow eyes, long-lobed ears, thin nose, and pointed chin, whose kinship to the carven face of Ngranic might stamp them as those to whom a dreamer might pray. Save for that one tower room, the onyx castle atop Kadath was dark, and the masters were not there. Carter had come to unknown Kadath in the cloud waste, but he had not found the gods. Yet still the lurid light glowed in that one tower room, whose size was so little, less than that of all outdoors, and whose distant walls and roof were so nearly lost to sight in thin, curling mists. Earth's gods were not there, it was true, but of subtler and less visible presences there could be no lack. Where the mild gods are absent, the other gods are not unrepresented, and certainly the onyx castle of castles was far from tenantless. In what outrageous form, or forms, terror would next reveal itself, Carter could by no means imagine. He felt that his visit had been expected, and wondered how close a watch had all along been kept upon him by the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep. It is Nyarlathotep, horror of infinite shapes and dread soul, and messenger of the other gods, that The fungus moon-beast serve, and Carter thought of the black galley that had vanished when the tide of battle turned against the toad-like abnormalities on the jagged rock in the sea. Reflecting upon these things, he was staggering to his feet in the midst of his nightmare company when there rang without warning through that pale-lit and limitless chamber the hideous blast of a daemon trumpet. 3 times pealed that frightful brazen scream, and when the echoes of the third blast had died chucklingly away, Randolph Carter saw that he was alone. Whither and why and how the ghouls and night gaunts had been snatched from sight was not for him to divine. He knew only that he was suddenly alone, and that whatever unseen powers lurked mockingly around him were no powers of Earth's friendly dreamland. Presently, from the chamber's uttermost reaches, a new sound came. This too was a rhythmic trumpeting, but of a kind far removed from the 3 raucous blasts which had dissolved his grisly cohorts. In this low fanfare echoed all the wonder and melody of ethereal dream, exotic vistas of unimagined loveliness floating from each strange chord and subtly alien cadence. Odors of incense came to match the golden notes, and overhead a great light dawned, its colors changing in cycles unknown to Earth's spectrum, and following the song of the trumpet in weird symphonic harmonies. Torches flared in the distance, and the beat of drums throbbed nearer amidst waves of intense expectancy. Out of the thinning mists and the cloud of strange incense filed twin columns of giant black slaves with loin cloths of iridescent silk. Upon their heads were strapped vast helmet-like torches of glittering metal, from which the fragrance of obscure balsam spread in fumous spirals. In their right hands were crystal wands whose tips were carven into leering chimeras, while their left hands grasped long, thin silver trumpets which they blew in turn. Armlets and anklets of gold they had, and between each pair of anklets stretched a golden chain that held its wearer to a sober gait. That they were true black men of Earth's dreamland was at once apparent, but it seemed less likely that their rites and costumes were wholly things of our Earth. 10 feet from Carter the column stopped, and as they did so, each trumpet flew abruptly to its bearer's thick lips. Wild and ecstatic was the blast that followed, and wilder still that cry, that chorused just after from dark throats somehow made shrill by strange artifice. Then down the wide lane betwixt the 2 columns of lone figures strode a tall, slim figure with the young face of an antique pharaoh, gay with prismatic robes and crowned with a golden chant that glowed with inherent light. Close up to Carter strode that regal figure, whose proud carriage and swart features had in them the fascination of a dark god or fallen archangel, and around whose eyes there lurked the languid sparkle of capricious humour. It spoke, and in its mellow tones there rippled the mild music of Lethean streams. "Randolph Carter," said the voice, "you have come to see the great ones whom it is unlawful for men to see. Watchers have spoken of this thing, and the other gods have grunted as they rolled and tumbled mindlessly to the sound of thin flutes in the black ultimate void where broods the daemon sultan, whose name no lips dare speak aloud. When Barzai the Wise climbed Hageth-Kla to see the great ones dance and howl above the clouds in the moonlight, he never returned. The other gods were there, and they did what was expected. Zeneg and Aphoret sought to reach unknown Kadath in the cold waste, and his skull is now set in a ring on the little finger of one whom I need not name. But you, Randolph Carter, have braved all things of Earth's dreamland and burned still with the flame of quest. You came not as one curious, but as one seeking his due, nor have you failed ever in reverence toward the mild gods of Earth. Yet have these gods kept you from the marvelous sunset city of your dreams, and wholly through their own small covetousness, for verily they craved the weird loveliness of that which your fancy had fashioned, and vowed that henceforth no other spot should be their abode. They are gone from their castle on unknown Kadath to dwell in your marvelous city. All through its palaces of veined marble they revel by day, and when the sun sets they go out in the perfumed gardens and watch the golden glory of temples and colonnades, arched bridges and silver basined fountains, and wide streets with blossom-laden urns and ivory statues in gleaming rows. And when night comes they climb tall terraces in the dew and sit on carved benches of porphyry scanning the stars, or lean over pale balustrades to gaze at the town's steep northward slopes, where one by one the little windows in old peaked gables shine softly out with the calm yellow light of homely candles. The gods love your marvelous city and walk no more in the ways of the gods. They have forgotten the high places of earth and the mountains that knew their youth. The earth has no longer any gods that are gods, and only the other ones from outer space hold sway on unremembered Kadath. Far away in the valley of your own childhood, Randolph Carter play the heedless great ones. You have dreamed too well, O wise arch-dreamer, for you have drawn dreams' gods away from the world of all men's visions to that which is wholly yours, having builded out of your boyhood's small fancies a city more lovely than all the phantoms that have gone before. For know you that your golden marble city of wonder is only the sum of what you have seen and loved in youth, the glory of Boston's hillside roofs and western windows aflame with sunset of the flower-fragrant common, and the great dome on the hill, and the tangle of gables and chimneys in the violet valley, where the many-bridged Charles flow drowsily. This loveliness, moulded, crystallized, and polished by years of memory and dreaming, is your terraced wonder of elusive sunsets. And to find that marble parapet with curious urns and carven rail, and descend at last those endless balustrade steps to the city of broad squares and prismatic fountains, you need only to turn back to the thoughts and visions of your wistful boyhood. Onward, onward, dizzily onward to ultimate doom, through the blackness where sightless feelers poured and slimy snouts jostled and nameless things tittered and tittered and tittered. But the image and the thought had come, and Randolph Carter knew clearly that he was dreaming and only dreaming, and that somewhere in the background the world of waking and the city of his infancy still lay. Words came again. You need only turn back to the thoughts and visions of your wistful boyhood. Turn, turn, blackness on every side, but Randolph Carter could turn. Thick through the rushing nightmare that clutched his senses, Randolph Carter could turn and move. He could move, and if he chose, he could leap off the evil shantak that bore him hurtlingly downward at the orders of Nyarlathotep. He could leap off and dare those depths of night that yawned interminably down, those depths of fear whose terrors yet could not exceed the nameless doom that lurked waiting at chaos's core. He could turn and move and leap. He could, he would. Of that vast hippocephalic abomination leaped the doomed and desperate dreamer, and down through endless voids of sentient blackness he fell. Aeons reeled, universes died and were born again. Stars became nebulae, and nebulae became stars, and still Randolph Carter fell through those endless voids of sentient blackness. Then, in the slow creeping course of eternity, the utmost cycle of the cosmos churned itself into another futile completion, and all things became again as they were unreckoned kalpas before. Matter and light were born anew as space once had known them, and comets, suns, and worlds sprang flaming into life, though nothing survived to tell that they had been and gone, always and always, back to no first beginning. And there was a firmament again, and a wind, and a glare of purple light in the eyes of the falling dreamer. There were gods and presences and wills, beauty and evil, and the shrieking of noxious night, robbed of its prey. For through the unknown, ultimate cycle had lived a thought and a vision of a dreamer's boyhood, and now they were remade a waking world and a old cherished city to body and to justify these things. Out of the void, the violet gas had pointed the way, and archaic Nodens was bellowing his guidance from unhinted deeps. Stars swelled to dawns, and dawns burst into fountains of gold, carmine and purple, and still the dreamer fell. Cries rent the aether as ribbons of light beat back the fiends from outside, and hoary Nodens raised a howl of triumph when Nyarlathotep, close to his quarry, stopped baffled by a glare that seared his formless hunting horrors to grey dust. Randolph Carter had indeed descended, at last, the wide, marmoreal flights to his marvellous city, for he was come again to the fair New England world that had wrought him. So to the organ chords of morning's myriad whistles and dawn's blaze thrown dazzling through purple panes by the great gold dome of the State House on the hill, Randolph Carter leaped shoutingly awake within his Boston room. Birds sang in hidden gardens, and the perfume of trellised vines came wistful from arbours his grandfather had reared. Beauty and light glowed from classic mantel and carven cornice and walls grotesquely figured, while a sleek black cat rose yawning from hearthside sleep that his master's start and shriek had disturbed. And vast infinities away, past the gate of deeper slumber and the enchanted wood and the garden lands and the Serenarian sea and the twilight reaches of Inganok, the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep strode brooding into the onyx castle atop unknown Kadath in the cold waste, and taunted insolently the mild gods of earth whom he had snatched abruptly from their scented revels in the marvellous Sunset City.